Richard Johnson is a senior lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University of London. He joins me now from Oxford, England. Good to have you with us.
Good morning.
So Americans were hoping to hear from President Trump about how he plans to make their lives more affordable. He claimed, quote, the economy is roaring, but very few Americans agree with that assessment. That's according to the polls, at least. What stood out to you, big picture?
Big picture, this was a speech to the party, not necessarily a speech to the nation. Donald Trump's approval rating is just sub of 40%. And there are different ways that a president whose approval rating is in that area can try and improve it. One is to try to win the approval of independents and supporters of the opposite party. There was no attempt really to do that in the speech. He called Democrats crazy. He described them as destroying the country. This is an extraordinary thing. If we went back 10 years ago to Barack Obama's final State of the Union address and said that the next president will be talking in such terms, we would have thought it to be unbelievable. But what I think he is doing is he's trying to improve his approval ratings among Republicans, because that has dropped as well. He's about 80% approval among Republicans. So if he can boost that up to, let's say, 90% or even 95%, as he's had at various points in his presidencies, then he could push himself back over and above the 40% line. I do think that that's the big picture political calculation that's going on here.
And Richard, as President Trump doubles down on his sweeping global tariffs and as he amasses the largest US military buildup near Iran since the Iraq War, threatening to strike that country if Iran fails to agree to a nuclear deal, the latest CNN poll shows 68% of Americans think the president has the wrong priorities. Did he say anything Tuesday night that would change the minds of most voters about those priorities?
Well, I think when it came to foreign policy, he skirted over some of these big issues. He hardly had anything really to say in great substance about the case for military intervention against Iran for example, which if you compare to, say, George W. Bush and the State of the Unions in the lead up to, say, the Iraq War, there was a huge amount of effort and attention that President Bush devoted to those issues. I think in terms of the sort of topics that the president focused on, he was, for much of the speech, I mean, it was a very long speech, the longest State of the Union address, he did focus on the economy, and he didn't talk about issues like his ballroom and his arch and the Trump Kennedy Center and so on, which he has talked about. He seems to like to talk about those kind of physical architectural legacy projects of his, but those aren't popular and those are seen as distractions. So I think someone in his White House team, maybe a group of people, sat him down yesterday and said, look, no mention of those pet projects. You need to try to focus on the economy. But there's a difference between what people hear and what people experience. And that's really where the test will be in November. This is probably the last time President Trump is speaking to a majority Republican Congress, unless polls change dramatically between now and November. And I'm not sure that he gave Republican lawmakers actually great assurance, especially those in swing districts, that what he said this past night is going to help them save their seats.
And I do want to talk about November in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you, because dozens of Democrats boycotted the president's address and a few protested during the speech. What exactly does that strategy achieve?
You know, it is a growing development in State of the Union addresses. We first saw this actually during Obama's presidency when he was heckled by a Republican lawmaker who shouted, "You lie." That was a huge event. A lot of people paid attention to that. They thought this was a great breach of the civility of the State of the Union. You know, the State of the Union is the American version of the British King's speech, and you don't heckle the king when he gives the King's speech. But what's happened is that partisanship has become such that this has gone from a speech of state, a speech of ceremony, a speech that's above politics, to effectively a partisan intervention, a party political speech. And that's why you see Democrats choosing to respond to it as you would a party political speech, either by not attending the rally, insofar as that's what it's become, or actually expressing their disapproval at points. But the president himself has invited this with the kind of rhetoric that he has used in his speech to describe, as I said, Democrats as crazy and destroying the nation. So that's not the kind of language you would have expected to see in a State of the Union address 20 years ago, indeed 10 years ago. But now it's become, in the sort of post-2016 era, par for the course.
And of course, the President's State of the Union address comes a week ahead of the first primaries for this year's midterm elections. How likely is it that Trump changed his political fortunes around, and what might all this signal for November's elections? Just very quickly.
I think it's not going to change the dial very much. Where he might try to have made a difference is trying to boost enthusiasm among core Republicans. That will help his backed candidates in the primaries in the spring, and he might try to address something of the enthusiasm gap in November. But to be honest, I think Democrats are much more motivated to turn out in November than Republicans at the moment.
Richard Johnson, thank you so much for your analysis. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.